This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Thad Hait. Hi Thad, how are you doing?
I'm alright, how are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm looking forward to talking to you about a special interest of both of ours and I think all of our Primitive Culture listeners, which is Star Trek, but looking at it from a particular angle that I think should be an interesting one to tackle.
Yes.
So the topic that we're looking at today really is neurodiversity in Star Trek, also perhaps in Star Trek fandom, because I think there's definitely a certain amount of overlap there.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting topic. I have to say, it's not something that I had thought about a huge amount until a few years ago when I started going to conventions and listening to the kind of questions that the actors were being asked. You know, I've seen Brent Spiner fielding quite a lot of questions about data and neurodiversity. Jerry Ryan similarly talking about 7 of 9 and neurodiversity. And I guess maybe this is something that's come about sort of in the last few years, certainly not when those shows were on the air originally, maybe as much in the 90s. But I think it's a really interesting one because these days, definitely there are a lot of characters in Star Trek who one can read. I mean, we've talked before on this podcast about queer coding. We can read them definitely as kind of neurodiverse coded, if not explicitly neurodiverse characters.
Yes, and plenty who may not have been coded that way by the writers, but can certainly be read that way regardless.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really interesting aspect of going back, you know, those of us who are somewhat obsessed with Star Trek and going back to them over the years and over the decades. I mean, you know, with the Trill in Deep Space Nine, a lot of people these days see Jadzia Dax as a trans character. Now, I don't feel that people back in the 90s were thinking along those terms. So I suppose it's partly just about our own ideas about different identities and different kinds of people developing and then being able to see that in some of those characters. But I wanted to talk to you because I'm kind of curious what your own experiences are with Star Trek and with neurodiversity and how those have sort of fed into each other over the years.
Sure. So it's funny, you may or may not have intended it as a joke at the beginning when you said a special interest of ours is Star Trek. Because
it was a deliberate joke, yeah.
Okay.
That was intentional on my part.
I wasn't sure, honestly.
But that's okay, because humor can be subjective, and sometimes these things are unclear, and, you know.
Yeah, well, and that's a whole other neurodiversity can of worms. But yes, because obviously, for various forms of neurodiversity, which by the very term it's defined, it means there are a lot of different things that make one neurodiverse, obviously, because that's what diversity means. But for autistic people in particular, and to some extent for ADHD as well, a special interest is something that you do become very obsessed is probably the best way to describe it, of various things. And yes, Star Trek is certainly one of mine. I am on the autistic spectrum myself. I was diagnosed when I was probably around 14 or 15. But certainly even before that, it wasn't like I was very much a different child from the neurotypical people. So for me, I, as a child, certainly related very much to Data on Star Trek TNG, because I saw him in a very similar situation where he was trying to fit in and learn about human behavior and interaction from a way of someone who does not fully understand how it works. And that was definitely something that resonated with me, having a very similar experience, even if I didn't really know what it was yet at that time.
That's really interesting. So had you already started watching Star Trek when you got that diagnosis? And
Yes.
Did you make that connection at the time?
So I started watching Star Trek when I was 7, I believe. Had watched, my older sister actually introduced me to it because she was into Star Trek as well. And yeah, I watched, first started watching TNG, but TNG and TOS were both on, in syndication every night, during the week. So I would watch a lot. This was in the early to mid 90s. Because when I was 7, it would have been 93. So like right as TNG was finishing up, but I wasn't watching like the new episodes. I was watching the syndicated ones. But then I got into DS9 and Voyager. DS9 starting with season 3 and Voyager from the beginning. So yeah, I was very much an obsessed Trekkie long before I knew that I was autistic. But yes, when I got that diagnosis, and it had been a sort of thing, like my parents had, done all sorts of things to try to, for lack of a better way to describe it, to find out what was wrong is the wrong thing, but, to find out what was different or about me.
What was up?
Yeah. I was diagnosed with ADHD much younger, but autism was just not something that was part of the cultural zeitgeist much in the mid 90s. It wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that became a thing that people really talked about. And when you did talk about it back then, you thought about people on, I guess we would say, the other end of the spectrum, who nonverbal people who, that sort of thing. So for people like me who, at the time of my diagnosis, were diagnosed with what used to be referred to as Asperger's syndrome, now is not considered a separate form of autism, and really shouldn't be called Asperger's syndrome since Hans Asperger was, a Nazi. But for people like me, that just was not considered a thing. If you were able to talk and function in society more or less, like you could communicate with people, you could read, you could write, you could do all these things, that was not generally even thought of as autistic until the late 90s is when that really started becoming a thing. So that's when I got my diagnosis. And yeah, as describing that sort of thing, it all sort of fell into place. A lot of my behaviors, a lot of the things that I had loved and seen. Yeah, I definitely saw how that related to the way that I saw myself in characters like Data or Odo or Spock or the EMH on Voyager, that sort of thing.
Who, interestingly, when we think about Star Trek, are classically the most popular characters. I mean, there is something striking about that, isn't there? and I do wonder, kind of anecdotally, it feels like, I mean, this is a massive stereotype. I suppose insofar as like all the jocks at school are into football or whatever, there is a kind of, the geeks and the nerds who are into Star Trek, there is probably more neurodiversity among those kind of communities or those groups. So maybe there's a kind of obvious parallel there. I don't know, but I think it's really interesting that particularly, people kind of gravitate towards those characters. I mean, maybe everyone does. I certainly gravitated to all those characters, and I don't know whether
I think it's some of that, and I think part of it is also those are the interesting characters. Yeah, those are the characters that are not your standard normal. Okay, I don't want to say normal. Mm-hmm. Your bog standard, typical human character. They're more boring. The Data is a fascinating character. He's just much more interesting generally, I think. So I think even for a neurotypical person, they would see that and find that character to be more interesting than the characters than like Geordi LaForge or Riker or even Picard to some extent.
Or Harry Kim.
Certainly Harry Kim. Like, no one I won't say no one, very few people have looked at Harry Kim and said, oh, that's an interesting character.
Yeah. Garrett Wong, maybe, but...
Garrett Wong is way more interesting than Harry Kim. Harry Kim...
That is true. Yeah. Yeah. No, they'd probably be in a minority. Interestingly, though, Picard, I think, is a character who you could say, in some ways, or in some episodes at least, has... flashes of kind of neurodiversity about him. I mean, there are episodes where people say to him, you're like a robot, you're like a Vulcan, you're kind of, he's not a Kirk or a Riker or a kind of, he's not a jock. Let's put it that way. He's definitely got some of those qualities.
Interpersonal skills are
special interests, isn't he?
Are not always his forte.
No. Small talk is a struggle. He can do diplomatic, He can do the kind of big interaction stuff, but on the smaller level, definitely there's a bit of a challenge there. Yeah. But it's interesting because with Picard, I guess, particularly, with the new series, the Picard series, some of that stuff is being kind of brought round to trauma and there's a lot of trauma for Picard on around various things, I suppose. And some of these kind of diagnostic categories and so on, I suppose there can be uncertainty between, what's neurodevelopmental, where's the boundary between that and kind of mental health, for example, and anxiety and, all these kind of different elements. And I think it's really interesting when you were talking about, in the 90s, ADHD was kind of sort of having a moment. I mean, I remember that my aunt was diagnosed with ADHD around that time while she was working for Microsoft at the time, and literally everyone in her office and most of their kids were on Ritalin at the time, and it was like a big thing.
Oh, it was the wonder drug.
But yeah, exactly. So that was definitely kind of in the, I don't know, that was part of that era, I suppose. But yeah, I guess autism in particular, historically there was a lot of stigma, I think, and that is gradually, hopefully being kind of chipped away at, and people's understandings of, what this spectrum is that we're talking about and what that means are developing. But definitely, there are parallels, I think, with the kind of trans, experience in some ways. These are different identities that we're kind of getting to understand more. And there's a lot of, certainly historically, a lot of stigma. There's a lot of politics. I mean, like you were saying, not using the word Asperger's. Well, a few years ago, lots of people would have used the word Asperger's. Yeah. I mean, I'm by no means an expert on any of this. I do have people in my family who are autistic and also who have ADHD, as I say. So I have some familiarity with some of this, but I'm sort of conscious of the politics and of trying to get these things right and not to offend anyone and not to, use the wrong language or say the wrong thing or whatever.
And there are still many people who do use Asperger's. There are people who will tell you they have Asperger's, and that's the term they want to use. And I mean, if someone wants to use that term to describe themselves, far be it for me to speak otherwise. I would personally, go with the way that it has been categorized as just part of the autism spectrum, especially with the information that came to light within the last 5-10 years about the experiments that Hans Asperger did on children for the Nazis. I mean, don't really want to associate myself with his name.
No, for sure. Well, for what it's worth, I have, in an attempt to kind of educate myself, I've pulled up a copy of the DSM-5 on my screen, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I think is what it stands for. It's like the massive, great textbook for diagnosing all these sorts of things. So I just thought I'd pull it up and have a look at some of the kind of definitions and see what in Star Trek they might kind of inspire. So just looking at autism spectrum disorder, I'll read you the brief definition. You can jump in and tell me if you think any of this is total nonsense or whatever, or it doesn't fit with your experience at all. But anyway, it says autism spectrum disorder is characterized by persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, including deficits in social reciprocity, non-verbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, and skills in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. In addition to the social social communication deficits, the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder requires the presence of restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests, or activities. Those, I guess, are the special interests that we were talking about, like being obsessed with Star Trek and talking about Star Trek the whole time, which, I think we can all relate to one way or another. But I guess the main thing that jumps out is it's the social element, isn't it? And that's why someone like Data, I think, feels so perfect as a kind of like as effectively an autistic character, because first of all, you've got this kind of empathy question, because he supposedly doesn't have emotions, although I know some people argue that he clearly does have emotions, and it's all a sort of, he thinks he doesn't have emotions, and
I'm in that
he
camp.
Really?
He
which,
definitely has
so
emotions.
that's an interesting debate, and which also relates to, some people think autistic people don't have emotions. That's also not true, but it's about how are they expressed, how are they understood, etc. But definitely with Data, that he has social communication problems, let's say. Certainly if you think of like early, season 1, season 2 kind of Data, that is a lot of his character comes down to misunderstandings, failed attempts at humour, not getting, turns of phrase, taking things literally, all these kind of things that are sort of classic autism traits.
Yeah, and Data specifically vis-a-vis the emotions, that in and of itself is very, very familiar for autistic people, because yes, Data reacts in many ways that show that he does in fact have emotions. He just doesn't understand emotions. He doesn't understand and I think the emotion chip gives him more obvious interaction with his emotions, but before he has the emotion chip, he definitely demonstrates various emotions. It's just he doesn't know how to communicate those emotions, and he doesn't know how to understand them, which is in and of itself an autistic trait. Autistic people definitely have emotions. And we also have empathy. That's another stereotype that is not true. We do have empathy. We just sometimes have trouble understanding our own emotions, so don't always understand someone else's. But with something bad happens to someone, we can understand how that would make us feel, and we can definitely empathize. But it's very much a thing that with autistic people, I can't always tell you how I'm feeling. I am feeling certain ways, and there are times when I will have an emotions will just sort of seethe under the surface that I don't really follow until at some point they burst. Now, obviously, that's not a Data thing, but it is an autistic thing. And a lot of times I can't fully explain, even to myself, much less to other people, how something makes me feel. I mean, many times, sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. And I would say that that's something that people with autism tend to get at least somewhat better at over time, just learning, coping mechanisms, or at least making it appear as though we're more in touch with our own feelings and whatnot. But if someone asks me how I feel, heck if I know.
Like Spock in
yes,
Star Trek 4, of course. Just another.
I do not
how do you
understand
feel?
The question.
That is the. Yeah, exactly. That is, and I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, people talk about Spock as an autistic character as well. I think in that film in particular, that sort of comes to the fore in some ways because of the kind of, I was going to say memory loss. It's not exactly memory, because of everything he's been through. He seems less. He's less sort of confident. He's less himself. He's less sort of authoritative. So there's this more of this kind of naivety, this sort of Data quality, which I guess is something that you do, sometimes see in autistic people, especially in autistic children, for example. There is a kind of often a sort of naivety relative to their peers who are more streetwise or more cynical, and so on. So I think definitely that kind of characterization sort of seems to fit that model in some ways. And obviously, the Vulcans, obviously people could argue that the whole of Vulcan is autistic in a sense, yes. In that their whole, because they have this sort of attitude about emotions. But obviously they do have, again, they have emotions, they express them differently, they deal with them differently, they process them differently. I think when it comes to Data, it's this interesting question, isn't it? yes, on some sort of literal level, we have to accept, because the writers keep telling us Data doesn't have emotions, and and Troy doesn't feel anything from him. And you know, there's some reality on which someone either does or doesn't have emotions, and Data doesn't have them, whatever they are, however we understand them. But at the same time, the way the stories are written, maybe this kind of goes to the whole, you know, the Roddenberry box and the kind of conflict between the sort of theory of Star Trek and the actual reality of Star Trek. Over and over again, you have these moments where they sort of only really make sense if he does kind of have some emotion. And we empathize with Data, even though he claims that he doesn't feel anything. They use it for dramatic irony. I'm just thinking in Data's day, I mean, there's lots of examples of this, but there's definitely an example there where he says, you know, oh, if I had emotions, I think I'd be a bit worried by this. Or, you know, it's these kind of things. Well, what on earth kind of a statement is that? Because he's clearly indicating that. And, you know, the music underscoring it is probably indicating the same thing and so on. So I don't know. I think it's like this weird, it does almost come down to the kind of allegorical side of Star Trek. You know, is Jadzia Dax a trans character? Is she allegorically a trans character? Is she literally a trans character? Is Data maybe not literally neurodiverse because he's an android? Is he? Do you know what I mean? Does he literally not have emotions? I don't know. I feel like all these questions sort of come up, maybe partly when we try to read what's going on in Star Trek rather than just taking everything at face value. Because a lot of these things are kind of operating on multiple levels. And even, as you say, you know, levels that the writers may not have been conscious of, that the actors probably weren't conscious of. I mean, it's interesting. Jerry Ryan now, playing Seven, is aware that Seven is seen as, you know, a neurodiverse character. But I don't think she was 20 odd years ago. And I don't know whether that impacts the actor in terms of, you know, performing something like that, whether there's something that they're conscious of. Because Seven, I've seen lots of interesting discussions about Seven in Picard and the way that at certain moments she becomes more like the kind of old Seven, you know, more, not unemotional exactly, but slightly more stilted, slightly more kind of rigid. And I think that is, you know, I don't know if that's your experience, but certainly that's something that I've experienced with people on the autism spectrum, that it varies, you know, that it can vary from, depending on anxiety, depending on other kind of mental health things, that sometimes people can, that this thing of like, you know, presenting emotions or whatever, it can vary in terms of how that's presented or how that person comes across. And I think that is, assuming that's a deliberate choice on Jerry Ryan's part, or maybe an unconscious choice, I don't know. It seems quite interesting that sort of plays into that there's an element of, whether that's to do with it being a kind of constriction, or if it's to do with, you know, you sort of alluded to the idea of masking. Is it that, you know, 7 of 9 in Picard is much more competent at masking and kind of presenting herself in a more neurotypical way? Or is it that traumatic, difficult, stressful situations immediately kind of reconnect to those sort of slightly more restricted ways of interacting? I don't know, but it's interesting. I think that it's, again, you know, this is a character that again is sort of raising all these questions.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's, I think it may be a combination of the two. I think some of it is masking, and I think some of it is just in the 20 odd years between the end of Voyager and Picard, she has become more assimilated into human culture and is just more used to that sort of thing. But I think the fact that she does sort of go back to the old Seven in a stressful situation shows that it may be somewhat masking, but it may just be the way people are. Because I know a lot, excuse me, I know a lot of people, for instance, who have grown up with one particular pattern of speech, but have adopted another, will often revert to the accent that they first had when as a child in a stressful situation. So I feel like it's the same sort of thing there.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting with Jerry Ryan. Yes, she has definitely said in interviews that she did not see it when she was playing Seven, but she actually has an autistic daughter, so she now definitely recognizes that and sees how it has that impact on people.
That's really interesting. It makes me think as well that there's something about Seven that reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you watched 24, but that was on kind of around the same time, I guess, kind of maybe a little bit after Voyager. But there's the character of Chloe in 24, who I think a lot of people took as an autistic coded character, although nothing is ever, discussed. And for her, it comes across as this slightly... she's quite grumpy. That's the main thing. I'd say for like the first season or two that she's in, she mainly just seems to be in a mood the whole time. But she's very impatient with people. It all comes out in quite sort of negative things. But it's interesting. Then you have someone like Sylvia Tilly. I've seen a lot of people saying, is she an autistic character? Obviously, completely the opposite. Extroverted, extremely friendly, very sort of guileless. But that is also something that I have noticed. With kids anyway, that with girls, I mean, this is going to be a massive generalization, but it does seem like often with boys, it pushes towards directions of like, or at least what you see, and this may again be about masking, you see it come out in terms of frustration, rigidity, kind of finding the world infuriating in various ways. In girls, it often seems to come out in terms of actually being extremely sociable and warm and friendly, but kind of guileless and sort of unusually forthcoming. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Lacking that kind of reserve, that sort of streetwise, whatever it is. So it is that kind of naivety in a sense. And obviously that's, as I say, a massive generalization. And those girls probably, get home and are grumpy as hell and, etc. But I do think that there are these different presentations, I suppose. And maybe they are gendered to some extent, or tend to be gendered to some extent as well.
I think, yeah, to some extent, yes. And I think, but another part of it in general is just different people are different. So it is certainly possible for one person to view things one way and one person to do it another way. So you can certainly have a very grumpy person, or you can have an outgoing person. And in the same way that neurotypical, there can be grumpy people and outgoing people. It's the same thing for autistic people. We're not all the same person.
Sure. No, of course.
And that's the one thing that it is a spectrum. So there are autistic traits that apply to some, but not all of people. So there are many things that some people have that other people don't. And that's how that works, basically. So I definitely, the moment Tilly came on screen on Discovery, I definitely picked up on her appearing to be coded as neurodivergent.
Mm-hmm. And that's because of her sort of, she talks too much. She goes on about stuff. Is that what it is? It's like the kind of bubbly, she's not always following. She swears, for example, doesn't she? And then Stamets says, "No, it's okay," But there's she's not sufficiently. Well, not sufficiently. She doesn't necessarily follow all the same social rules as everyone else. She gets so excited about what's going on in her own sort of bubble that she oversteps those marks to some extent.
Yes, that's exactly it. And she's, for lack of a better word, she's very awkward. Mm-hmm. And that sort of thing is very much a neurodivergent thing. I would say I am much less awkward today in my 30s than I used to be. But anyone who knew me as a child or a teenager would certainly recognize a lot of Tilly in the way I would behave back then. And I would say that a lot of it is just, it's through learned behavior and reinforced behavior and masking to a degree. I have trouble with the concept of masking because I can't tell where the mask ends and I begin at this point. Like, I don't know how much of it is truly masking or just having learned to behave in certain ways. Like, I understand what masking is, and there are certainly some things that I do, but in a lot of ways, it just, if you mask for long enough, it just basically sort of becomes you in for many things, not for everything certainly, but for a lot of things, a lot of my own personal quirks and whatnot, I would say that it's not that different. Like, some of it is some things that may have started out as masking just sort of turned into regular behavior. And that's one of the therapies for autism is repetitive behavior. And there are, that can be controversial. Pretty much every treatment of autism is controversial in one way or another. But it does help in a lot of ways, especially for someone to interact with society who expect people to behave in a certain way. That doesn't necessarily mean it's good, but that's how it works.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I would say to some extent, I don't know. I mean, maybe my understanding of masking isn't quite all there, but like everyone presents themselves in certain ways in different situations, and some of those require more energy and are more genuine than others. I mean, if we're podcasting, we are talking in a different way to how we might if we were just having a drink in the pub or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a consciousness, and it's not that different, but it's different enough that I'm conscious, when I turn the microphone on, a sort of part of my brain wakes up a little bit more. It's a performance to some extent. And I suppose that's true of, any social interaction is a performance relative to just, loafing around in bed or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So, I don't know, maybe it's kind of an extension of that. But I suppose the difference is a lot of, neurodivergent people find, I suppose, maybe are conscious of the masking and there's an awareness that it takes a toll and that it is exhausting and it's draining. And that, I guess the question, when you were saying about these controversial therapies, yeah, it sort of is the therapy about trying to make you seem different to how you are. Do you know what I mean? To seem more like other people. And I was going to ask you actually, with someone like Data, I mean, is it a problem that Data appears to be a sort of effectively a neurodivergent character who obsessively wants to be neurotypical? He wants to be human, as they put it. He's the kind of Pinocchio story. And obviously Star Trek has this kind of real sort of human chauvinism to some extent. I mean, it gets pulled up in The Undiscovered Country, this idea that being human is being best. But I think, over and over again, there is this kind of sense that, it would be, it's worth anything if I can, suffer and emote and all these kind of things. That's much better than being the kind of cool, collected, supposedly emotionless one. So for Data, that's the goal. That is to become more human, to become more sort of neurotypical in some ways. I don't know. Is that a problem to some extent that Star Trek is kind of, that these characters, other than Odo, I think Odo is kind of the exception, and Spock to some extent, because they're both kind of quite satisfied to a certain degree with who they are.
Well, I think even Odo tries.
He does. You're right.
Especially
he does.
If you look at, especially when you look at his relationship with Kira, he tries very hard in those instances. And I think,
and he literally, I mean, if you talk about masking, Odo is literally masking all the time, isn't he? And when he gets exhausted, he can't keep it up anymore, and he dissolves into a puddle of goo, doesn't he? He literally can't. The mask, requires more energy than he has at a certain point.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but yes, that very much could be interpreted that way. I think to some extent, yes, you can see that as a problem, but I think many autistic people would tell you that they want to be, that they empathize with Data wanting to be part of that same group. And seen as, and not necessarily seen as different. So I would say for me personally, I would, if I were, I wouldn't know how to not mask completely in a social situation. And I don't think anyone should. I mean, in general, that's just how we do social situations. You mentioned podcasting. Yeah, it's like podcasting. Absolutely. I turn on I will stop swearing for the next hour filter when I start podcasting.
We appreciate that.
So yeah, I mean, it definitely can. It definitely could be seen as problematic, and I think it's important for people to be true to themselves. But at the same time, it is not necessarily wrong to want to fit in And as long as you're not doing something that is false to your own self, then it's fine. I don't see a problem with it in and of itself. I will say that and combined with the fact that I'm generally pretty introverted means that social interaction is, well, I definitely in 2020 learned that I do need it, is can be very draining, and I don't tend to hang around in very social situations for extended periods of time because of that.
Sure, and that's interesting, and that also is something that 7 of 9 certainly can relate to. I was looking at the episode Human Error, and there's a line where Tuvok says to her, basically, we both... I can't remember, he says, I share your discomfort with social gatherings. There's a sense that they both try to make excuses to sort of get out of these social situations. I think with Data, it's interesting. I was watching the episode Tin Man recently, which I think is, and some people I think have seen the character of Tam Elbrun as, interestingly, I mean, obviously he's not just empathic, he's telepathic, he's kind of a hyper empath, but he definitely, has that sense of kind of like autistic burnout. You might think of it as. I mean, he's very but being around other people is incredibly draining for him. He finds it exhausting. He feels overwhelmed by it. He's been hospitalized for stress, which is interesting because there's also quite a significant kind of correlation between neurodiversity and mental health and anxiety and depression and these kind of things.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of that character. But he says something very interesting to Data because he, I think, sees Data, wanting to be more human, and questions it a little bit. And he says to Data, perhaps you're just different. It's not a sin, although you might have heard otherwise. So that feels like that is Star Trek kind of just seeding this little idea, that maybe, I don't know, maybe being human and emotional and all this stuff is not all it's cracked up to be. I don't know. And obviously there is this big question, Data feels like he's less than everyone else on that crew, but everyone knows he's the most, he's the character we all love. Do you know what I mean? Like he's the most sort of perfect, the most kind of decent. I mean, you said, it's important to be honest to yourself. He's the most, there's even that episode, Thine Own Self, isn't there? To thine own self be true. He's the most true to himself at all times. He's sort of incapable of not being true to himself in a sense. In First Contact, he has that line, he was tempted for 0.68 seconds or whatever it is. That's the kind of
for
absolute,
an android, that's an
exactly,
eternity.
but that's the absolute maximum of Data's kind of not being true to himself and not being the best version of himself at all times. So there is that sort of weird irony there, I think, that he thinks that everyone else has something that he doesn't have, but actually he's the one that we should all really sort of be aspiring to be in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate. And I think that's part of how the show, it shows us, Data striving to be more human, but at the same time, the rest of his crew, his friends, accept him for who he is, and that's the important thing and the important message that we get there. That's the thing that meant so much to me when I was a kid watching Star Trek. Right,
that's interesting. That they don't judge him, they don't mock him, they don't actually. Interestingly, they don't treat him, apart from maybe Pulaski, and I feel like in the early seasons there are a few times they get a bit. Frustrated with him sometimes when he's sort of going on and on. But yes, absolutely, you're right. They respect him. They love him. He's very much one of them. In a way that, say, Barclay, when he's first introduced, isn't actually. I think that's an interesting point of comparison. Barclay also has a lot of kind of neurodivergent qualities.
Oh, yeah.
And he, to begin with, is pretty much, maybe bullied is going a bit far, but they don't treat him well, recognizing that he's different from them. Yeah. They're not very accommodating of that, to begin with. I feel like as time goes on, Barclay becomes sort of more respected and more beloved. But certainly to begin with, it's a source of friction, the fact that he's different.
Yes, very much. And that's a episode that can be hard for me to watch for that exact reason. That said, I do very much empathize with Barclay. Barclay is a character that I can certainly feel like I understand very well because of that. But the crew does show growth where Barclay is concerned.
Yeah.
And they, even in that episode, they come to accept him. And the same is true with Pulaski and Data. If you look at Pulaski's character growth throughout season 2 of TNG, we start off in The Child, where she's mispronouncing his name, and then we end in Peak Performance, where she is championing him and telling him, pushing him to continue with the competition in the stratagema there. And because she knows that he can do it, that she definitely turns a page and views him as another person. That is something that she did not believe in the beginning, which obviously that was a pretty horrible opinion of hers to have at the beginning, but it showed character growth. And I think we get the same thing with Barclay. Even by the end of Hollow Pursuits, they are accepting him. Like, that's how the episode ends. And then in the later episodes, where Barclay has other issues, they help him. Yeah. And they accept him, and he's definitely become one of them. And then we continue on. I think some of Barclay's best episodes are in Voyager, except that one with the Ferengi. That was bad. But and I think it continues in Pathfinder. We see how Barclay's direct superior very much has Barclay's best interest at heart. He's trying to help him in every way he can. And I think that shows, again, that these people who are not necessarily the same as everyone else are still accepted in Federation society. Absolutely. And yeah, I think there is an interesting trajectory there. I personally, and this is probably a more controversial view, I think that episode, whichever one it is, of Voyager with Barclay and Troy in it, is probably one of the best Deanna Troi episodes, aside from being a great Barclay episode. It's a very good Deanna Troi episode. I agree with you on that. It's like they finally work out how to use her kind of superpowers in a way that makes sense and feels still believable. I don't know. Yeah, I think in some ways those characters, maybe it is partly that with someone like Barclay, they bring him in. They're not necessarily quite sure what they're doing with him. I mean, obviously he is primarily a comedy character, I suppose. Certainly I always used to think, watching Next Gen, when in first run, I would sort of think, oh yeah, it's that funny guy. It's going to be a kind of comedy episode with that silly guy, basically. Do you know what I mean? That and this was me as a child kind of interpreting it. But sure. That's how I saw it. Oh, I felt the same way. A bit like Sana Troy is, you know she's going to turn up and there's going to be kind of mayhem and hijinks and it's all going to be a bit silly. It's not going to be a, serious, big, deep philosophical issue type episode. And I suppose there's an element of that as well with someone like Data. A lot of these traits, they are played for laughs. I mean, for example, the taking things literally. I think it's in theory, when Data is kind of pursuing romance and he goes to get advice, and he says to Guinan, I require advice, and she says, don't look at me, and he literally looks away. He doesn't look, yes. Takes things literally on such a and sometimes with Data, I think it can be a bit inconsistent insofar as you think, really in however many years on this ship, you haven't heard that expression, or you haven't, do you know what I mean? The things that he apparently doesn't know, despite having been in Starfleet for a certain period of time, are sometimes a bit surprising. But I think there is that element that him taking things literally, him misunderstanding, usually is played for laughs. The other instance of it that I don't know why this struck me when I first watched it, and I thought it was really interesting, is in Who Watches the Watchers, where is it Riker is on the planet? One of them anyway. They're basically communicating, and the only communication can be through kind of non-verbal noises. And Data doesn't understand what they mean. So, they ask a question and Riker's like, or, making these kind of noises that everyone understands. And I think that's quite interesting because those are, one of these elements of, the sort of diagnostic categories
is about non-verbal communication, gesture, facial expression, body language, tone of voice, all these sorts of things. I just thought that was quite interesting, that scene. And I don't know why it stuck with me over the years, that someone else has to literally translate for him what those communications mean, that we as the viewer, or at least as the presumed viewer, understand, but he needs, despite being this very, very intelligent. I mean, that's the other thing is, Data is like the smartest guy on the ship by a million miles. Despite knowing everything, he can't, he has to have these things sort of translated for him in order to understand what they mean. And
that's definitely a good representation of what it can be like in, to be neurodivergent. I mean, body language is a big one, and inferring things that are not stated, taking things literally, that's all very much, those are very much autistic traits, and things that can definitely cause confusion. So, I think it is fascinating to me how well the character of Data represents someone who is autistic without having been designed that way.
Mm. Well, also, when you're talking about body language, the other thing that jumped into my mind was that scene in Data's Day where he learns how to dance. Mm-hmm. And the tap dancing,
I was thinking of that too, yeah.
But then the ballroom dancing, he's like really rigid, and he's got this kind of plastic grin on his face. It's this sort of like, because it's in this region of like sort of romance, and I don't know, as soon as the music shifts into that kind of register, he like becomes totally fake. And actually in theory, when he's trying to be romantic, he sort of plays this really weird parody of a kind of sort of 1950s movie husband, with the kind of honey, I'm home sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. And it's really uncomfortable. And, and she's like, Data, stop it. What the hell are you doing? Because it's so, it's too much, and it's I don't know. It's fake. It's synthetic. It's not, it doesn't feel genuine at all. I mean, when you were saying, about being true to yourself, it's not true to Data in the least. And that's why it registers as so sort of uncomfortable. It's interesting that, both Data and Seven have these episodes where they have their kind of romance episode, where they have to, experiment in those areas. Data's kind of goes wrong because he can't really, I don't know, we know he's fully functional, but he can't really do the kind of the romance stuff. Seven, it sort of seems like she's doing better in some ways. And it's interesting. She obviously wants to, I mentioned this idea of her, skipping out on the social events and so on, but clearly she wants to be going to them, because we see in the holodeck, she's practicing. She's actually doing what, you were talking about, these kind of interventions or these therapies. Social scripts is one big thing, for kids with autism, where you go through a kind of scenario in advance of, okay, so this is what you're going to do. This is what who you're going to, sort of planning out in advance effectively what it's going to look like, a social interaction. And that's literally what Seven is doing. She's practicing all these things, so that she can then go and do them with other people. And obviously, as we know, she does end up, controversially going out with Chakotay somehow. But it's interesting. But in the episode, she's not really awkward and stilted. I know there's this issue about, like, is she playing the piano passionately enough? But she seems, to me anyway, to be doing pretty well throughout that episode. What's holding her back is this kind of, is something that can't be changed. It's something to do with her biology, or it's something to do with her implants or whatever, which I think it's interesting. So it's like she's battling against her own physiology somehow, to some extent. And there's this interesting question at the end of the episode where the doctor says, it might be possible to change this, but it's a big operation. I don't know what the recovery is going to be like. It's kind of, and she says, no, don't, I don't want to do all of that. It's not so important to me to, have romances and experience all this stuff. And I don't know if you watched The Orville, but they played quite a similar kind of beats in a recent episode of The Orville, which very
sort
much
of in reverse.
What
because Isaac was willing to do it, but
yes, you're right,
yeah. So that's what I meant by that. Isaac was willing to do it, even though it would mean losing his memories, which I think,
yes,
as we talked about many other things, proves that he has emotions too. He just doesn't necessarily recognize them.
Yeah. And it's this really interesting question. I mean, that seemed to me, I don't know about you, I felt like that was a more explicit kind of allegory for these kinds of questions around neurodivergence and treatment and so on, because literally he's given the choice, like, okay, you can be, it's a bit like there was that book, this is on a different subject, but there was a book with a great title, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. He can be either be himself but not be emotional and not be sort of what other people expect him to be or what his partner expects him to be in the relationship, or he can be changed to be more loving and affectionate and demonstrative, but he literally loses his identity because his whole personality has to get wiped in the process. So I thought that was a really interesting and quite stark way of presenting that. I mean, in a very, obviously everything the Orville does is in a kind of very Star Trek-y way, but more on the nose in some ways than Star Trek has done that.
I think, the Orville has been, especially this season, has been sort of very heavy-handed with their allegory. Not that that's a bad thing. I just, that's how they've been doing it. And I think it's worked really well for them, especially this latest season of the Orville has been fantastic, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. And it's the first time that it feels, I mean, I took a while to come on board with the Orville, I think. I know a lot of people like straight away were like, oh, this is the Star Trek we need, you know, all these kind of people hating on Discovery and loving the Orville. I never really got that because I thought it was a bit silly and kind of funny. But I feel like in this season,
it was
the humour is almost, it was okay as a kind of spoof, but it was a bit, it felt slightly pointless. This season, it does genuinely feel like, they're doing it really well. Do you know what I mean? Like, and they've kind of not quite forgotten that it's meant to be a comedy, but it's like, that's very much just part. They're doing it as well as a lot of Star Trek did it back in the day, on a kind of episode by episode basis. And granted, they're only doing like 9 or 10 of them rather than, 25 a year or something, but
I think the switch to streaming really benefited them because if you've, I'm sure you've noticed the episodes this season, a lot of them have been like an hour and a half long.
They're really long, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that has really the switch to streaming that gave them time to make the new season. Like, I mean, it's been years since season 2. There was a pandemic in there, but even if you take out the time off for COVID in the middle there, it took them a very long time to make this season. And that's because when they first announced the switch to streaming, the reason they said it was so that they could take their time with creating it. And I think that really paid off because in the first season, I thought it was all right. Like, I enjoyed it, but I didn't think it was anything special. Season 2, I think they really started to find their footing, and it did get a lot better, I think, in season 2. But then season 3 has just been phenomenal.
Yeah, one of the things I like about this season of the Orville, and I am conscious that I sound like one of those guys who has like been saying this for years, and I was quite hostile to it, is that they did this episode with Isaac. They've also done this whole trans allegory with the daughter of Bortus and Clyden, and that whole story being very powerful. Yeah, Topa. And I just think it's kind of interesting because we recently talked on Primitive Culture about trans representation in Discovery and this kind of having sort of explicitly trans characters, having, prior to that, having, gay characters, not doing all these things allegorically. Whereas like in the 90s, okay, so if these issues were touched on, it would be an allegory, about an alien species that, allows you to tell that story. Now it seems more like, we're going to have representation on a more direct level. So we're going to have gay representation by just having gay characters. It doesn't have to be an allegory. It doesn't have to be complex like that. Okay, the Trill one is a little bit, or the trans one is a little bit complicated by the fact that there's this Trill storyline. So it's kind of like, is it sort of, I was going to say straight representation. That's a very bad way of putting it. Is it kind of direct representation in a sense of like we're casting trans actors as trans characters, or is it also a kind of allegorical representation because we're dealing with this species where people have different lives as different genders? But I just thought it's kind of interesting that, does Star Trek need, I mean, maybe that's the case with Sylvia Tilly. She's human. She has these traits, and the same with Barclay, I suppose. But like Seven, Data, these are characters, Spock even, these are characters who they're sort of allegorically neurodivergent, but maybe not literally neurodivergent. I mean, maybe they are. Maybe Seven of Nine, maybe Annika Hansen would have been anyway, but we sort of take it that it's to do with her experience with the Borg and so on, that a lot of this stuff comes from. I
think Barclay absolutely is.
That's true, I think, yeah. So maybe they've kind of done that already. Is it important that they are explicit about it at some point, do you think? I mean, would it make a difference because they had this whole thing with Spock and his basically dyslexia, didn't they, that came up in Discovery, which obviously never been mentioned before. I mean, would it make a difference insofar as it makes a difference for representation to have gay characters, to have trans characters and so on, to have a character who doesn't just seem to be neurodiverse, but actually is explicitly neurodiverse? I mean, do you think that's something that I
would love to see that.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think it's quite the same as not having gay characters and now actually having gay characters in Star Trek. I don't think it's quite the same because we definitely, for me personally, and I obviously cannot speak for all neurodivergent people or even all autistic people, but I see representation in a lot of these characters, even that are not explicitly neurodiverse. And I would love to see someone who's explicitly stated as such, but I don't think it would have as significant an impact for me as, say, Paul Stamets does for gay people.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose it's also about these kind of, I don't know, there's questions of representation. There's also kind of questions of visibility. And sometimes some of these things, they are, more or less visible for various reasons with different people. And that's sort of part of the whole spectrum, I guess, isn't it? That is kind of part of the experience and part of the phenomenon. But yeah, who knows? Maybe that's somewhere, we've got plenty of Star Trek series coming down the pipeline.
We have, according to
sooner or later.
According to San Diego Comic-Con, we have 2 more shows that they are currently working on that they have not yet announced. So yeah, we've got all sorts of things going on. And it wouldn't surprise me if we do get neurodiverse representation explicit in the show. I think it certainly will come at some point.
Neurodiversity in infinite combinations, right? That's got to be,
nice.
Couldn't get more Star Trek, could you? Well, Thad, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this subject and getting your personal take on it and your thoughts on how this has played out over Star Trek's history. Before we go, let our listeners know where they can find you online and what else you've been up to.
Okay, best place to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Tyrannicus, that's Tyranicus, where I talk a lot about Star Trek. I have been slowly going through my incredibly mad plan of watching all of Star Trek alphabetically by episode title. And I am currently in the letter D.
Now that, without wanting to like stereotype or whatever, that feels to me like a kind of this is like, I don't know how would you describe that? It's like, because it's sort of arbitrary and it's rules, isn't it? I suppose that's the thing. It's like about imposing rules and the enjoyment of the rules, whereas someone else might be horrified by that idea.
It is a very neurodivergent thing to do.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's also a lot of fun because. As someone who has seen all of Star Trek multiple times, it keeps it fresh because you're never watching the same show more than 1 or 2 episodes at a time. And so I would definitely not recommend it for first-time viewers, but it is an interesting thing if you're not a first-time viewer and you just want an interesting way to rewatch.
What do you start with? If you were a first-time viewer, what was the first letter A, or did you do the numbers first?
I did numbers first because Microsoft Excel decided to put them first when I was organizing them. So the first one I started with was 1159, followed by 1100 or however it is, and then there's another number that I'm forgetting. But then I went into the A's, and each time when I get to the end of a letter, I then like go through and I say what my top 5 were, and then what my least favorite was. It almost felt like a cheat when I got to C, because I obviously couldn't pick a least favorite other than Code of Honor.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, it's a lot of fun. I haven't done it in a little bit, but I'm going to get back into D very soon. But anyway, you can find me where I talk about Star Trek and all sorts of other things. If you want to listen to me talking about Star Trek, I am on the Infinite Diversity podcast on the BQN network, where we talk about every new episode of Star Trek after it comes out. So we're on a kind of hiatus at the moment, though we will have an episode coming out very soon about the Comic-Con news. But that's a lot of fun. We talk about Star Trek a lot. And then if you want to hear me talk about something other than Star Trek, I have another podcast with my friend Carl called License to Spiel. That's license spelled with a C, like the British do, where we talk about the James Bond films.
Fantastic. Another great, in-depth topic
Yes.
to dive into there for sure. But interestingly, one with very different, I suppose, associations to Star Trek, right? I mean, the jocks do like the the kids who bullied us at school for liking Star Trek wouldn't have a problem with that one. So
and it's interesting because I don't think that happens anymore. I don't think kids get bullied at school for liking Star Trek anymore.
Is that true? I know people always say that. I always sort of wonder whether that's just kind of wishful thinking. Do you think that genuinely is true?
It might be wishful thinking. I mean, I'm obviously not a kid, but it just seems as though Star Trek and nerd culture is much more mainstream now than it was when we were kids.
Well, I hope that's true.
The Marvel movies are huge now. That's just entered popular culture, basically.
But isn't that... You see, I sort of always thought that's Star Wars was always big, but Star Trek was seen as geeky and cliquey and... I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I mean, I really hope that is true. And maybe if that is true, then also, obviously younger people are more accepting of... hopefully of neurodiversity than older people, maybe. Some of those stigmas and so on have kind of fallen away. So yeah, maybe that's all part of the same kind of, movement into the future.
Well, as Star Trek fans, I think we would all like to believe that we are moving towards a better future.
We can only hope. Yeah. Well, in the meantime, it's been great talking to you, Thad. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're blended, all right.